Friedman, and I'm going to be sharing with you this morning on the theme of history, prophecy, and perseverance, hope in God, in Daniel chapter 11. We're going to be thinking about some of the themes that we've seen throughout the book of Daniel. One of the things that I'm thinking about is the theme of perseverance. This came to me especially sharply in the recent past. I was conversing with friends and interacting with friends who've been working in a part of the world where suffering has often been in the picture among God's people. These are folks who worked in some of the toughest fields in the world. A field where I remember a number of years ago, at a time when many countries in Asia had what they were calling visit, our country year, like visit India year or visit Malaysia year, visit Singapore year. This country, my friend had talked about how someone he was discipling had gone to their village, and strung across the main street of the village was a banner that read, "United together to eradicate Christianity by the year 2000 in this particular country." There was actually a program, a promotion to get rid of Christianity and Christians from this country within a certain time frame. As you can imagine, many of the believers in that setting were not feeling the love. They were feeling the hostility. Some of them were really experiencing the hostility in direct ways. They were being deprived of work. Their farms were being ruined. Some were even killed for their faith in this particular country. They continued forward with the work, both my friends and people from that country continuing, and they suffered tremendously. Again, disciples of theirs, leaders that were being raised up, have suffered, even been killed for their faith. And yet, there is a genuine disciple-making movement in that context. It has been remarkably fruitful. Thousands upon thousands of people have come to faith, and tens of thousands are hearing the good news of Jesus on a regular basis. It's something that's just blown my mind to realize what some people have to deal with. I've dealt with some of these things, having worked in Asia myself, and even in the North American context, I've dealt with some of these things. I was thinking about how many of you would know I teach online classes for Asbury Theological Seminary. Probably the most remarkable group of students I ever had was included, I believe it was a class in mission and biblical theology, and some of the students were, a small group of them, were Nepali refugees from another nation in the region where they'd been forced out, and they'd ended up languishing in refugee camps in eastern Nepal for many years. And while they were there, some people in some of those locations, some people were able to go in, share the gospel, and a number of them were coming to faith in Jesus. And then the doors opened for thousands of them to come as refugees to North America, and many of them were coming to faith. One of my students there had actually started a Nepali denomination of people from this other country in North America. Another student in the same class was from the nation of Eritrea. He was telling a story of how he had organized a kind of an underground prayer meeting in that context, and they had, not long before the meeting was to take place, he was in prayer, and he felt like the Lord spoke to him, "If you go to this prayer meeting, you're going to be arrested and thrown in jail." But he thought, if I don't go and other people are arrested, they're going to think I set them up. So he went, and sure enough, he was in fact arrested, and he spent 6 months in jail for his faith in a very, very unpleasant situation. We think about this especially in the context of the book of Daniel. As we've gone through the book of Daniel during this season here at North Shore Fellowship, a key part of the message of Daniel broadly is that God is sovereign over the nations. And even in the midst of persecution, he will uphold his people, sometimes delivering us from suffering, sometimes strengthening us through and in the midst of suffering. So we're going to pick this apart, but one thing I'm not going to do in this particular video is I'm not going to read through the entirety of chapter 11 of the book of Daniel. We'll kind of go through it bit by bit, and we'll jump around a little bit, partly because chapter 11 is quite long. It's more than 40. It's some 45 verses long, and I don't, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read the entire thing. Now the first verse in the chapter is really a follow-up from the previous chapter. In chapter 10, as we heard last week from Pastor Raphael, it's really about spiritual warfare. And this folds into what I'm going to describe in a little bit as apocalyptic literature, where an otherworldly figure comes and reveals something about what's happening in the heavenlies to a human who conveys that to us. Often these things contain all kinds of crazy symbols and different ways of looking at reality. But this is kind of how Daniel 10 is framed. And it's this angelic figure has come basically having to fight his way through to reach Daniel past the principality, the spiritual power over Persia. And he's arrived for the purpose of giving this message to Daniel. It's an important message. And so verse 1 of chapter 11, remember the chapters are artificial. The chapters themselves were added later, as were the verses. But verse 1 states that during the first year of Darius the Mede, he took his stand to support him. He means not Daniel, I think that's a reference to this angel, is supporting Darius the of Persia. Now verses 2 to 4, I'll break it up into several sections. Verses 2 to 4 are something we saw described in different words in chapter 8. Basically the conflict between Persia and Greece and the emergence of these kind of successor empires to the Greek Empire. In verses 5 through 20, approximately, the struggle between the Ptolemies, based in Egypt, and the Seleucids, based in Syria, for regional domination, including over the land of Judea. Verses 21 to 32a, the first part of verse 32, the focus comes in on the evil king Antiochus Epiphanes IV, the leader of the Seleucid Empire, and who we know from the Hanukkah story. And then I kind of bracket the second part of verse 32 through verse 35, which is the response of the wise who know their God in the midst of these circumstances. And then finally, verses 36 to 45, the focus on Antiochus seems to segue into something else, quite possibly a focus on a future Antichrist figure. Now, in the next section, I'm going to take a few minutes to unpack the historical pieces of this chapter. Now, while there have been some scholars who have suggested that these parts of Daniel are written later, looking backwards, I take the position of scholars such as Tremper Longman and others who see this whole thing as prophecy. And I think that's the way it's framed as well. It's worth adding, Chuck Smith notices that Daniel appears in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew and Aramaic Bible, Old Testament, that goes back to at least 2 centuries before the birth of Messiah, the birth of Christ. And so the idea that it must be a look back because it's this detailed history kind of brings to the forefront some presuppositions that some folks may have that kind of prophecy, predictive prophecy, isn't possible. I would take issue with that. It's also, as I mentioned a few moments ago, apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is a way to understand it is, and this is kind of my translation of a scholarly quote from a scholarly source. Apocalyptic literature uses story or narrative to present revelation from an otherworldly being to a human, revealing a world beyond our own and an ultimate salvation. And I think that's true in especially Daniel from chapter 7 onward. But we're going to see in this particular place too. It's prophetic, but it's also apocalyptic. Now, while Daniel is presenting this again as prophecy, looking forward, we would see most, but not quite all of this, as history. Now, one of the questions I often ask when I teach a class in history of world Christianity. And one of the questions I'll often ask my students is I'll say, who here likes history? Who would you describe yourself as a history geek? Who here, when you hear the word history, you're like, really? And usually about half the students will kind of, sometimes enthusiastically, sometimes reluctantly raise their hands. And then sometimes, and then I'll say, well, who's not into history? And some folks will be like, yeah, well, that's me. So bear with us because it's unavoidable here. Some people, like, they don't like history. If they go, for example, there's a group of us, say we go to a museum with a lot of historical artifacts. There's kind of three groups of people. There's going to be the people who are going to take out their phones and are just going to be texting and be like, is it over yet? Can we go home? Is there food? Right? Then there's the second group of people that maybe are walking around and they see something cool and they'll be like, cell phone, and they'll be taking selfies, thinking about what they're going to put up on Instagram or TikTok, something like that, which, no judgment or anything. I like to take photos in those places as well as elsewhere as well. And then there's the people, but it's a little bit like Indiana Jones, kind of going to exotic locations and seeing what he could get to build his fame and fortune, so to speak. And then there's folks that are more like kind of like Gandalf, rifling through the papers to do his research to get down to the final truth, or like those annoying people like me in the museum who are part of the group, but they're lagging behind because we must read all the captions. Anyway, whereof I speak. One of the things that we're going to notice, too, is some parallels with what we heard from Pastor Raphael earlier on Daniel 8, which covers some, but not all, and in less detail, of the same historical territory. The repetition, though, it's worth pointing out, is often in Scripture, when something is repeated like that, it's done for emphasis, as is elsewhere in the Scriptures. So let's get into things. Verse 2, now then I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Now, the list of kings in Persia isn't meant to be exhaustive, but likely includes Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes. The 4th richest king could be Xerxes, who many scholars identify as the Ahasuerus, who was Esther's husband. He certainly was very, very wealthy, and he, in fact, did launch an attack on Greece. And it was not successful, but he was not the one under whom the Persian Empire fell. So some scholars would go the other way and say maybe it was Darius III, about 100 years later, who was not as wealthy as Xerxes, and not as famous or as powerful as Xerxes, but he was the one who was there when it fell to Alexander. It's probably true that you could say I lean towards Xerxes on this, partly because Xerxes kind of got the ball rolling in the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians in that regard. Verse 3 and 4. Then a mighty king will arise who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. That obviously is Alexander the Great rising up with a Greek army out of Macedon, the Macedonian king conquered Greece, and then with a Greek army and Macedonian army conquering all the way down to Egypt and across all the way to the Indus River in what is now Pakistan. And you had Greek influence there, by the way, for many centuries afterwards. One of the Seleucus, who was the founder of one of the empires that came out of Alexander's empire, fought against one of the great kings in the Indian context, Chandragupta, and they kind of fought to a draw and agreed to kind of intermarry and have a marriage alliance. One of the arguably the most famous of all the Indian emperors, the Maurya Emperor Ashoka, was actually a quarter Greek. I was today years old when I found that out. Isn't that wild? So we and then it says, after he has risen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the four winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. Now again, this is Alexander the Great. When he died, his eventual successors were the four Diadochi, who broke the kingdom into four realms. And for our purposes here, the important ones are the realm of the Ptolemy, which had their power base in Egypt. Those are the kings of the south. And the Seleucids, who had their power base in Syria, the kings of the north. I mentioned Seleucus, who fought against Chandragupta. Seleucus is the founder of the Seleucid dynasty. Judah, or Judea, the beautiful land, was right in the middle and frequently served as a battleground between these two empires, rather like a person trying to stay alive while they're between fighting elephants. I hate when that happens. Verses 5 to 20 then describe the back and forth battles and intrigue between these two kingdoms. I'm not going to go over all of it for the sake of time, and because I don't think we need to go over all of the historical details of this. One colorful episode, I'll jump around a little bit. One particularly colorful episode is found in verse 6, or alluded to in verse 6. After some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power. Now, what's this a reference to? The Seleucid king married the daughter of the Ptolemaic king to forge an alliance. But in order to do so, he divorced his own wife. Later, though, he and his first wife reconciled, and he brought her back so that he would have two wives. And the first wife was a bit of a character herself. She poisoned the other wife and her husband and the child with the other wife, and took power. It's worth noting that the relationship between these two kingdoms, especially after that, was a little bit on the rocky side. These were folks that knew how to put the fun back into dysfunctional. Dang. Notice, by the way, how very miserable people in the seat of power and fame often are. How often we want to be rich, famous, and powerful. Oh, if only I had. But we don't realize how many such people are, in fact, disillusioned with what they've received or the pinnacle they've reached. There's an emphasis on the reign of Seleucid king Antiochus III through verse 19, and it is under his reign that Seleucid control over Judea is solidified. The historicity and specificity of this is underlined, for example, in verse 11, where it says, the king of the south will march out in rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. Well, that describes the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC. That's datable. Verse 14, in those times many will rise against the king of the south. Those who are violent among your own people, the Jews, will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. And we're not really sure what this means. If this is, because there's no real reference to this. This isn't the later Maccabee revolt. This is maybe something else. Maybe some Jews read Daniel's prophecy and say, let's try and make this happen. In any case, it's not going to happen under their own steam. The invader, verse 16, will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land and will have power to destroy it. And this is the emphasis on Antiochus III's rule over Judea. Verse 17, he will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom and make an alliance with the king of the south. And he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans will not succeed or help him. Antiochus III gave his daughter, Cleopatra, in alliance with the Ptolemies, but she ended up taking the Ptolemies' side. Now, she became Cleopatra the First. She's not the Cleopatra who you're thinking of when you hear the name Cleopatra, the one who, with the Romans and Mark Antony and all that. That was Cleopatra the Seventh. Verse 21, he will be succeeded. Now here's where we're getting into Antiochus, the fourth, the bad guy. He will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Now this is Antiochus IV again, the key figure in the next section and the central villain in the story of Hanukkah, as we will see, and as we've already discussed earlier in this series. Verse 27, the two kings. You have this picture of the two kings, Antiochus IV and the king of the Ptolemies, sitting across from each other, their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. Two things that this emphasizes. Number one, no matter how clever they think they are, God is still ultimately in charge and superintending this process. The other thing is, here's these two guys who think they're so smart they can outwit the other one, but they're both evil. We often think we have to choose a side when we're between a bear and a crocodile. Well, I don't know. Let them fight and let's just stand back and watch. Holy smokes. They're both evil in this case. Verses 31 to 32a, it says, his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant. Now, here is the story of Hanukkah, basically. Here's where the Seleucid military sought to forcibly Hellenize the Jewish people, and part of the Jewish people were actually in on it with them, and part of them were fighting against them. This is where you have Mattathiah Maccabee, and then he dies, then his son Judah Maccabee, and Simon Maccabee, and the others are fighting, and they get killed too. It's actually a hard situation. And they abolished the sacrifice to God, setting up an abomination, likely, Tremper Longman says, a meteorite representing Baal Shamem, that is the Syrian version of the Greek god Zeus, and sacrificing pigs upon the altar. There were then, and will be now, those who are willing to violate the covenant, and who will be susceptible to flattery and manipulation. Don't go there. Don't be like those guys. Be like these guys in verses 32, the second part of 32 to 35. I'm going to come back to that. First, I'm going to talk about, and we're not really going to read through, but I'm going to talk about verses 36 to 35, which the text shifts. Something different is going on. And they describe a king who seems to be a kind of extension of Antiochus IV, but he's different. Antiochus is thus, a lot of scholars would say, now it's shifted and now it's directly describing a future coming Antichrist figure. Antiochus is thus a model for what the Antichrist will be like. We see a possibly similar element in Revelation, where some scholars have seen a pointer to the evil Roman Emperor Nero in the cryptic number 666. Because because if you take the Roman words for Emperor Neron Kaiser, then you end up, and you transliterate it into Hebrew, scholars say, that calculates to 666. That doesn't mean that they were that Nero, that the Antichrist will be the second coming of Nero. But it means that the character of Antichrist would be similar to the character of Nero, of Antiochus, or of even modern figures such as Hitler, Stalin, or Mao. All of these are, some scholars have suggested, and I've thought about this before, Michael Brown has gone this direction too, that the devil doesn't know the day or the hour when Jesus will come. And so he's always got an Antichrist kind of at the ready, just in case. These verses then speak to violent end times, but again, the need to be faithful even amid such times. Some people are afraid of the last days, are afraid of the coming of Antichrist, of the possibility of suffering. Some people say, well, God will not allow us to suffer. He will take us out of there before there's suffering. But I want to think about this for a minute, and I want to circle back to verses 32 to 35. The second part of verse 32 says, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him, that is, Antiochus. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword, or be burned, or captured, or plundered. When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end. For it will still come at the appointed time. We are called, friends, we are called to faithfulness regardless of whatever tribulation we may face. Even as we see with those whose stories I told at the beginning of this message. I have interacted with people whose whole theology of the return of Jesus is wrapped around the idea that, again, God will not let his people suffer. This is not biblical, not historical, not even a proper perspective on the modern community of Jesus followers across the world. This could be a double meaning passage, prophetically about the Maccabees, who were wise and instructed others, but also in a way about what it means to be faithful. Faithfulness can sometimes mean suffering silently and willingly. I think of the 21 Egyptians, or maybe it was 20 Egyptians and one man from Ghana in West Africa, who were filmed being executed on the beach in Libya by ISIS for their faith. None of them would abandon their faith in order to save their lives, and whose faithful death sent ripples across the Middle East. As many saw this, and the Bible Society in Egypt actually published a pamphlet with a poem asking the question, here's these executioners with wearing black with their faces covered, and here's the faithful Christians with their hands raised, and their eyes to the sky, crying out to Jesus. And he asks, and the poem asked, who is really scared here? I was moved to tears when I read that. And many people across the Middle East have been coming to faith in Jesus, seeing these sorts of things. Now, faithfulness can also mean working practically and even politically for freedom and the maintenance of rights. Think of figures such as Harriet Tubman, guided by the Holy Spirit, bringing enslaved people to freedom, or William Carey, preaching the gospel and translating the Bible in India, but also working against the practice of burning widows in Indian society in earlier times. Daniel 11 gives us a picture not only of prophetically foreseen events which took place and will take place in history, but more importantly, of the God who has a hand in history and who we can trust. Now I'm going to cheat for a second and dip a finger into next week's text in Daniel 12:2. Since the final hope offered to us by God, the hope of deliverance, eternal salvation, and resurrection is there. Daniel 11:32-35 describes the wise who will resist falsehood and instruct many, even amid suffering, hardship, and dealing with insincere people in their midst. But Daniel 12:3 also says the wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens and lead many to righteousness. How then will we respond to the times in which we live? Will we trust God, whether events take a turn for which we hope or not, among the wise? Will we be like Daniel's wise friends, who told the king that they would be faithful to God, even facing death? A choice is set before us, and indeed, we must choose. We will choose. Father, in Jesus' name, thank you for your gracious love and mercy, and I do pray that your Spirit's grace, mercy, and power would be upon us, Father God. Be upon us throughout this week and beyond, helping us to be faithful to you, no matter where you bring us, no matter what the circumstance. In Jesus' name.